Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching the Iroquois Confederacy by Historia Civilis. So this is a bit of a random video topic. We've seen Historia Civilis do a lot of ancient history. We've seen him do early modern and modern European history. I believe this is his only video on Native American history. This one came out in 2018, so it's not that old. I'm kind of curious why he decided to make this video. Regardless, I think this will be an interesting topic. I don't know too much about the Iroquois Confederacy. Of course, I learned about them in high school, a powerful confederation of Native American tribes located largely around the northeastern United States, or what would become the United States, right? I'm curious to learn a little bit more. I'm sure Historia Civilis is going to do a great job with this one. So, if you guys enjoy this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out the Patreon or channel memberships, both of which are linked down below, and both of which will give you access to exclusive reaction videos. Anyway, with all that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
On December the 6th, 1811, the New York Historical Society invited former Senator and future almost President DeWitt Clinton to give a speech at their annual meeting. Clinton took them up on their offer and used the opportunity to deliver a 90-minute monologue, arguing that the Iroquois were, in his words, the Romans of the Western world. Wow,
that is quite the argument to make. I'm not sure anybody is the Romans of the Western world. That's an odd thing to say, but I'm very curious as to why he put it that way. We also see Historia Civilis pronouncing the name Iroquois. Where I was brought up, we always said Iroquois, though I'm sure Iroquois is the more French pronunciation.
Clinton's overall argument was that New York academia was not spending enough time studying the Iroquois Confederacy. This was true. The Iroquois definitely deserved some serious scholarship, but not for the reasons given by DeWitt Clinton. It was a common trope at the time to draw this artificial link between the Iroquois and the Romans, but in the final analysis, this turned out to be reductive and lazy and fundamentally wrong.
Yeah.
Today we can do better.
Okay, I'm very curious to see where this goes. I believe I've heard some chatter that the United States and the United States Constitution took some influence from the institutions of the Iroquois Confederacy, though I don't know how much truth there is to that claim.
There's a saying that goes, "The beginning of wisdom is to call things by their proper name." The name Iroquois doesn't really tell us anything useful, and the reason for that is that it's not their proper name.
Well, yeah.
The Iroquois are known among themselves as the Haudenosaunee.
Well, like a lot of names we use to describe native peoples, this is a name that Europeans gave to them, not what they called themselves.
Which means the people of the Longhouse. That should give us a clue as to who these people are. The Haudenosaunee are not one people, but many peoples, knit together by a common culture and political system. The 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee were, in descending order of size, the Seneca, the Mohawk, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, and the Oneida.
And a lot of familiar names here, probably some of the more well-known Native American tribes. Also, a lot of these names have been given to landmarks, lakes, cities, towns, whatever, by European settlers, so a lot of these should be familiar names to you.
These 5 nations formed a confederacy, each semi-autonomous, but united under one supranational government. We are going to tackle that government in a few minutes, but in order to understand it, we must first understand the Haudenosaunee's most potent political entity. Any guesses as to what that was? If only we had some kind of clue.
Yes, if only.
Oh, wait. We do. Proper names. They make history easy.
Yeah.
For centuries, longhouses were some of the largest and most sophisticated buildings on the continent, with some approaching 100 meters long.
I mean, look at that territory, by the way. That is a pretty large amount of territory to hold. If you imagine that with, say, the modern day United States placed over it, they are holding a good chunk of sort of the Midwest into the Northeast, and of course parts of modern day Canada as well. So that is a pretty incredible amount of territory to control.
Sophisticated buildings on the continent, with some approaching 100 meters long. The typical longhouse supported 6 to 10 nuclear families, each with their own little section, kind of like an apartment. Families opposite each other shared communal fires, which ran the length of the building. Pay attention, because the imagery of the longhouse and the communal fire is going to come up a lot when we get into the Haudenosaunee government.
Yeah, and that's not surprising. It's kind of interesting how everyday symbols or everyday structures, like the building you live in, a longhouse, or this communal fire that brings everybody together, can be repurposed to mean something a lot bigger. These everyday things become symbols for sort of wider messages and broader meanings. At least that's how I'm interpreting it, not knowing anything about the Iroquois, but I think this is a trend we can see in many societies throughout history. These everyday things that bring people together, repurposed into much broader symbols, often political symbols.
But we're not there yet. First, we need to discuss who got to participate in that government, because it's no simple thing. Haudenosaunee society was a matriarchy, meaning that ultimate political power rested with women.
Interesting.
The most important manifestation of this power was in the position of clan mother. The clan mother was basically the head of each family, but in this case the word family had a pretty expansive meaning. The term included the clan mother's spouse and children, obviously.
This is very interesting. Of course, if we look at European societies of this time, we're primarily talking about patriarchy. Men have the vast majority of the power, particularly the social and political power, and even, I think most Native American societies, at least Native American societies that I'm familiar with, still sort of played to that pattern. Some of them had more equality between men and women, but I think would usually lean towards men having more power. So this is unique at this time, and I think this is probably unique even amongst Native American societies.
Obviously, but also her daughters' spouses and their children, as well as her own sisters, their spouses, and their children. As you can imagine, a clan mother's family could easily number in the hundreds, which is where the clan part of the name came from.
Yeah.
Everybody in a clan mother's extended family were lumped together and thrown into one or several longhouses. On all political matters, the clan mother spoke on behalf of the entire longhouse. This was the most important political relationship in Haudenosaunee society.
And of course, this clan structure is not unique to the Haudenosaunee. We see a lot of societies throughout time where the most important bond one can have is familial ties. And a lot of societies really organize around family structure. We can look at, for example, one that I'm more familiar with, the Scottish clan structure. I'm Scottish myself, so I'm speaking of my own heritage, but if we rewind a couple hundred years ago, when the clan structure was still in full use, that was really the most important way to organize people, was through these relations, organized into these big families, these big clans, with usually a patriarch at the top. So we're seeing a sort of similar but different thing here.
Each clan mother was empowered to appoint men from her own clan into key political positions. While in these positions, these people became the personal representatives of the clan mother, and through her, the entire longhouse. This meant that she was also allowed to unappoint them at any time, for any reason.
Okay.
Historian William N. Fenton has said that there's no evidence of one of these political appointees ever, let me repeat, ever defying the wishes of his clan mother.
Wow. Although that does make sense because she has both the power to grant and revoke the position. And that revocation, basically a veto, is very important. If you just have the power to appoint someone to the position, that's still influential, powerful, but once they get there, they can do whatever they want. If you also have the power to revoke that position, then that political representative that you've appointed, they're going to have to maintain some level of loyalty to you, or at least act in accordance with your wishes.
All political appointees are simply known by the catch-all term, chief. There were 4 kinds of chiefs: civil chiefs, war chiefs, peace chiefs, and sachems. As you can imagine, civil chiefs governed settlements, war chiefs did strategic war planning, and peace chiefs dealt with diplomacy and trade. We can ignore sachems for the moment because we're going to get into that later.
Okay.
The most important thing to remember is that every chief was backed by a clan mother, and that the clans, through the clan mothers, remained the most important political unit.
So this is basically an organized and systemized way of having these clans interact with each other. We have these clan structures with the clan mother at the top, and then in order to organize the whole system, we have these political appointees who can then interact and, work out the settlements, war planning, diplomacy, etc., etc.
All clans within each nation were arbitrarily divided into 2 groups, which ethnographers call moieties. There's not that much to say about moieties right now, since they're largely ceremonial, but you need to know what they are because they're going to come up later. To summarize, 1 or several longhouses made a clan, several clans made a moiety, and 2 moieties made a nation. Clan mothers picked the chiefs, and the chiefs helped administer each nation. But there's one more thing we haven't considered yet: the actual subject at hand. The fact that 5 nations made a confederacy.
Yes, we've seen what builds up to create the nation, but the Iroquois Confederacy is several nations, so now we need to take it a step further.
The 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy met in Onondaga territory and formed the Haudenosaunee Council. Who did this? Sachems. Remember, sachems were the 4th category of chief that I said we'd get into later. Well, buckle up because we're getting into it now. The Haudenosaunee Council consisted of 50 sachems from across the 5 nations. Membership in the council broke down like this: the Mohawk sent 9 sachems, the Onondaga sent 14.
Interesting. I thought we might have some sort of equal representation, but no, each different nation has a varied number of representatives. I wonder if that was based on population or some other thing. I'm sure Historia Civilis will tell us.
The Seneca sent 8, the Oneida sent 9, and the Cayuga sent 10. It would be embarrassing if that didn't add up to 50. No, good. Under the Confederacy, the 5 nations considered themselves one family, living under the same longhouse. This symbolism was extremely important.
And that's exactly it. We're seeing those everyday important symbols, or everyday important things in people's lives, being repurposed to these broader political symbols, which just help everybody relate to one another and understands the relationship at hand.
The Mohawk were the founders of the Confederacy, and as such, they were recognized as the theoretical eldest sibling of this theoretical family in this theoretical longhouse. The Onondaga were recognized as the middle sibling, and the Seneca were recognized as the youngest sibling.
Okay, so we do have some sort of hierarchy between these nations. It's not necessarily equals, but fairly equal footing. We're talking about sibling relationships. Maybe the Mohawk would be sort of the first amongst equals, right? Or, aka, the eldest sibling.
Then, for a change of pace, the Oneida and the Cayuga were recognized as another set of child siblings, with the Oneida being the elder and the Cayuga being the younger.
Interesting.
This wasn't just for fun. The exact positioning within this family was the end result of some tough negotiations and would have real-world implications. I explained moieties a minute ago, and that's going to come in handy now. This family structure divided the 5 nations into 2 moieties. The Mohawk, the Onondaga, and the Seneca formed the senior moiety, and the Oneida and the Cayuga formed the junior moiety.
It's like at Thanksgiving, you've got the adult table and then the kids table. And the Cayuga and the Oneida, they're at the kids table. I'm sure, of course, they were still respected partners. But it's interesting you have this breakdown between senior members in the relationship and junior members.
Remember how different nuclear families would come together to share a fire in the middle of the longhouse? That conceptual framework came into play here. Council meetings took place around the eternal fire of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy.
Wow.
As hosts, the Onondaga Nation was entrusted with maintaining this fire year-round. During actual council meetings, for both symbolic and practical reasons, the job of maintaining the fire fell to the 14 Onondaga sachems, who sat.
And, of course, we see sort of eternal fires in different societies, different Greek states, Rome. Fire has been a very important symbol throughout history, and clearly the idea of an eternal fire, a fire constantly burning now and forever, has been a pretty attractive one to many different groups of people.
Sat in the center of the longhouse, closest to the fire. In the literature, these are sometimes called the Onondaga Firekeepers. The two remaining nations from the senior moiety sat together on one side of the fire, and the two nations from the junior moiety sat on the other. Let's get into how the council worked. Step 1. Somebody introduces a thing. Am I going too fast? This would normally be a foreign policy thing, so for the sake of clarity, we're going to pretend that one of the Mohawk sachems introduced a peace treaty or something. Step 2. Whichever nation brought the proposal would debate the issue among themselves, with everybody else looking on. Multiple speakers were given a chance to make their case, but eventually, the sachems within that nation had to come to some sort of consensus.
Fascinating. So when they propose whatever they're proposing, they don't need a united front, but they eventually need to work towards a consensus. That's a pretty unique way of doing things. I think in a lot of governments, when you have a faction, they want to present a united front from the beginning. If they have infighting, keep it behind closed doors. But in this system, that infighting or debate amongst members of the same nation is done out in the open, maybe to inform the larger debate around the policy proposal. Fascinating.
Without consensus, the proposal died. Step 3. Once a consensus was reached, the question got passed to the other nation within the same moiety. In this,
And I'm wondering what policy exactly was covered in these meetings. Historia Civilis mentions usually a foreign policy proposal, so I would imagine this might not be true, but sort of my inclination would be that maybe the nations are allowed sort of a high degree of domestic governance over themselves, but when it comes to foreign policy, trade, war, that kind of stuff, they came together to decide that, as a confederacy, as a whole. I'm not sure. That would be my guess.
In this case, since the Mohawk were in the senior moiety, that would mean the Seneca. For the time being, the Onondaga Firekeepers remained separate from this process. Within that sibling nation, the same process played itself out. There was another internal debate, and again, speakers got a chance to make their case. Just like last time, the question could not proceed until there was a consensus.
And it's interesting, a lot of political systems today use a majoritarian system. You need a majority to pass this, but oftentimes confederacies, or whatever kind of political union between different countries, different nations, different people groups, will rely on consensus. You need everybody to come together and agree on one thing, because of course a confederacy is a little less stable than other forms of government. We can talk about a unitary state or even a federation. A confederacy usually is composed of a couple of rather autonomous members who, of course, there's always the risk of someone breaking off. And so you don't want to upset anybody, and so this is why we go by consensus. A lot of international institutions are organized this way. You need consensus or close to consensus to actually get anything done, which is why a lot of international institutions don't get anything done, which frustrates a lot of people, but, that's how they've been designed.
Now, it starts to get complicated. If the two nations within the same moiety came to different consensuses, they would have to start the whole thing over again. Step 4. If that moiety reached a consensus, the issue got kicked across the fire for the other moiety's consideration. That moiety, in this case the junior moiety, would debate as one, and the issue would not proceed until they reached a consensus. However, and
keep in mind, there is a lot of power in going first. We can see the senior moiety debates first, then the junior moiety. It reminds me of something we've seen in Historia Civilis' videos. In, say, the Roman Senate, the first people to speak were the consuls and the former consuls. And they would really set the terms of the debate, set the mood, set the tone. And we have a similar thing here. The senior members of this organization are the first ones to speak. And of course, that's not to say that the junior moiety is always going to agree, or that they're always going to follow in the steps of their senior partners. Not at all. But going first in a debate certainly has its power. You do, on some level, get to set the terms, set the tone of the debate, sort of direct things, and there's a power to that.
this is key. The two moieties did not have to reach the same consensuses. Just to keep things interesting, we're going to pretend that that happens here. Step 5. Finally, the Onondaga Firekeepers got to weigh in. As the host nation, they got to position themselves as a neutral third party. Just like everybody else, the Onondaga had to reach an internal consensus. Now in this case, where the two moieties disagreed, the Onondaga got to play the role of tiebreaker.
Interesting. So this is overall a system based on consensus, but they've designed it so that you don't need total consensus between all the different nations to pass something. You basically need a majority, a tie broken by the Firekeepers, but that majority has to be reached by a series of sort of internal consensus. Very interesting.
And whatever they decided would become the final result. If, on the other hand, we were in a situation where the two moieties agreed, one of two things could happen. The Onondaga could simply endorse the group's decision, simple enough, or they could send the question all the way back to the beginning for a second round of debate.
Really?
If, after that second round, it came back to them again, they had no choice but to agree.
Okay.
Still with me? It's complicated, so let's give a simplified summary.
I'm still with you. It's complicated, but, this is a pretty large-scale system of governance, covering, I'm sure, quite a number of people, several different nations. I mean, we can look at any system of governance in the early modern to modern era, or even in ancient times. Any system of governance that has to make decisions for a large number of people, we're talking usually about quite complex systems of governance, particularly in sort of a council system like this. A system where it's not just one person deciding, everyone has to come together. Of course, there's going to be a pretty high level of complexity.
A person would introduce a question, then their nation would debate, then their sibling nation would debate, then the other moiety would debate, then the Onondaga would debate and offer their final approval. Each one of these steps required internal consensus. Let's consider the implications of a system like this.
Yes,
Internally,
let's.
the Confederacy was extremely unbalanced. The two most powerful nations were the Mohawk and the Seneca.
My goodness, and those are probably the two most famous nations from amongst this bunch. If you're American, I would guess you've probably heard of all of these nations, but if you haven't, you've probably heard of the Mohawk and the Seneca, particularly the Mohawk, but these are very famous nations, and as we can see here, they control a lot more territory than their siblings in this confederation, but everything's been fairly equalized in this voting or debate process.
And nobody else even came close. These two nations also happened to be located at opposite ends of the Confederacy. So take a moment and think. Which situation would the Haudenosaunee want to avoid at all costs?
Well, you certainly do not want the Mohawk and the Seneca sort of going up against each other, right? And so if you think about that, these are the two most powerful nations. I'm sure they have a large ability to make war. If they're going to fight each other, you've got a big problem. And so when you keep that in mind, you can start to understand some of the different facets of this system.
It makes sense when you look at the map. What they wanted to avoid was the Mohawk taking one position, the Seneca taking another position, and everybody in the middle being forced to pick a side. A situation like that can lead to a civil war.
Exactly.
Instead, what did they do? They said, Mohawk, Seneca, the group isn't even going to discuss your proposal until you two agree.
And so, also, now the sort of breakdown between elder and younger siblings starts to make sense. And this makes a lot of sense. You know, Seneca, Mohawk, we don't want you guys to fight each other. Not a war, but probably not even... We don't want you to be too polarized over any particular issue. And so we need you, the two big, powerful nations, to come to a consensus with each other before we pass it off to everybody else.
If the two heavyweights could not reach a consensus, the smaller nations never entered the debate. A similar thing happened if the proposal came from the other side of the fire. If there was a consensus among the smaller nations, but the Mohawk and the Seneca couldn't come to terms, the issue was dropped. Nothing happened. What else would the Haudenosaunee want to avoid? Well, you wouldn't want the Mohawk or the Seneca dominating the council, lest you spawn some kind of Mohawk or Seneca empire. So how did they stop this? The council isolated the two most powerful nations in the senior moiety. Remember, the two moieties did not have to agree, so if the smaller nations said one thing, and the powerful nations said another thing, the Onondaga, another small nation, got to break that tie.
That's interesting. So, putting the Seneca and the Mohawk in the senior moiety, it does give them some privileges. You know, clearly they have some power, they're the first to go, they need to agree or disagree on something before it goes to the rest of the nations. So it enhances their power in some ways, but it also restricts them. You know, it puts them in their moiety. You know, you're restricted to this, and we have our own moiety, and the tiebreaker is another smaller nation. So it is both a way to recognize their power and also restrict their power, at least in terms of these debates, making these decisions as a confederacy. Interesting.
In other words, if the Mohawk and the Seneca decided to gang up on the rest of the council, the smaller nations could still bypass them.
Yeah.
The council counteracted the imbalance within the Confederacy. It's really a remarkable invention. In the early 18th century, the Tuscarora Nation lost the war against the Europeans, and then migrated north, straight into Haudenosaunee territory. The Oneida proposed offering the Tuscarora full membership into the Confederacy. The Tuscarora were also people of the Longhouse. Same language, same culture. It made a lot of sense. Since the Oneida proposed the idea, the Cayuga were consulted next. After some internal debate, they agreed. With the junior moiety in agreement, the proposal was kicked across the fire to the senior moiety, who agreed as well. Finally, the Onondaga Firekeepers were consulted. They gave the thumbs up, and with that, the proposal was adopted. In 1722, the 5 nations became the 6 nations. The Tuscarora were adopted into the junior moiety as a new youngest sibling. However,
now we have 3 in each. Though, of course, the Onondaga, they are the middle sibling of the senior moiety, but they sort of play a third-party role, right? They're not really included with the Mohawk and the Seneca. But now we have another nation in the younger sibling bunch. Very interesting. Also shows that the Confederacy certainly had some room to move. It was flexible. They could bring someone else in.
A move that tells us that the Tuscarora were in no position to negotiate. They were not given any representation on the council.
Ah, okay. More of an observer nation then. You're brought in, but you're not allowed to make decisions with us. You just have to go along with whatever we decide.
Up until the mid-18th century, whenever European settlers wanted something from the Haudenosaunee, they would ask to see their chief. If you've made it this far, you should understand that that's a confusing request. Which chief?
Well, this is something the Europeans often did. If you look at European interactions with native peoples, they would often ask to see the leader, the chief, and they would negotiate with a chief, sign some sort of treaty, and then the Europeans would go, okay, we've signed a treaty with the, let's use Mohawk as an example, with the Mohawk people. And then, some of the other chiefs, whether they're within that nation or within a confederacy like this or whatever, say, no, you haven't. You signed a treaty with one chief. He doesn't speak for the rest of us. Of course, the Europeans didn't tend to recognize that distinction.
Even if they sent somebody, they couldn't make any decisions without first consulting with their clan mother. And they certainly could not conduct foreign policy without the council's approval.
Yeah.
This centuries-long miscommunication was completely avoidable. In 1811, when DeWitt Clinton delivered his speech before the New York Historical Society, academia was just beginning to take the Haudenosaunee seriously. It was long overdue. That's why he devoted so much time trying to convince his peers that the Haudenosaunee were, in fact, the Romans of the Western world.
I wonder if this is why Historia Civilis decided to do this video. I just thought of it right now, but did he do it because of that link? That they were known as the Romans of the Western world, which I and he recognize as sort of a spurious comparison. But I wonder if that's what brought him to this video, because it is certainly very different than most of his other content.
World. It's unfortunate phrasing, and by now you understand that it's not remotely true.
Yeah.
What he could have said is, you should take the Haudenosaunee as seriously as you take the Romans. After all, unlike the Romans, they're still here, still running what can plausibly be called the world's oldest democracy.
Well, I'm sure that's what he was trying to get across, making the comparison to the Romans, who the Americans and the Europeans would have respected and revered, to show that, hey, you should take the Iroquois seriously. Interesting. I'm kind of surprised Historia Civilis didn't touch on something I've heard. Like I said earlier, I know there is some chatter among academics that the U.S. Constitution and the U.S. government took some influence from the Iroquois Confederacy. I don't know anything about the claim, unfortunately. I think it was a claim made maybe a bit ago, and there's been a lot of debate, and I think a lot of people aren't entirely sure that it's true, but I have heard the claim. I don't know anything about it. I know other sources that the U.S. Constitution took influence from, but I'm not sure if it really did take influence from this system. Maybe some of you are scholars of the Constitution or early American government, or scholars of the Iroquois, however you want to pronounce it, and you can let me know if there's any truth to that claim, because I am really not sure. But regardless of that, a fascinating system of government. I certainly learned during this video. Like I said, we covered the Iroquois back in high school, but it's been a couple of years for me, and I haven't studied them since, so I think a lot of the stuff I learned I do not remember, and this was probably a refresher on some of that. I also always like to do a bit of Native American history. I think it's kind of underdone. People don't cover it enough, so I'm always glad when we get an opportunity. A very interesting video from Historia Civilis. I'm glad he decided to do it. Like I said, very much out of the norm for his usual kind of videos, but it was a good one. So if you guys enjoy this video, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe, check out the Patreon and channel memberships, both of which are linked down below, and both of which will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.